And then for today's feature presentation, we are so lucky to have Eric here with us. Eric is a good friend of Lake Champlain Sea Grant and has worked with us over the years. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Eric Leibensperger to speak about his research, identifying upwelling events in Lake Champlain's South Main Lake and assess related impacts. So Dr. Eric Leibensperger is an assistant professor of physics and astronomy at Ithaca College. He specializes in environmental physics, climate change, and air quality. Prior to Ithaca College, Eric was a professor at SUNY Plattsburgh for 8 years and worked with colleagues there to study the impacts of climate change and weather events on Lake Champlain. So welcome, Eric, and I will stop sharing my screen and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. I'll share my screen. Okay, so yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to be here. I've had a really good relationship with Sea Grant, as Ashley said. I also have a really good relationship with my colleagues at SUNY Plattsburgh, which is a fantastic place. I can't say enough positive things about the people and the Center for Earth and Environmental Science there. Is just a fantastic, wonderful, every positive adjective that you can think of, and the people there are just tremendous. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is data that was collected by myself or colleagues at SUNY Plattsburgh and by Tom Manley from Middlebury College. And so, there's my information, but there's so many people who contributed to this project, namely Tom Manley, who's been doing so much number crunching and data processing the last couple of months, and it's been super helpful. But the SUNY Plattsburgh side, of course, we have just kind of a whole host of people over the years who have been a part of projects that we've had, and including this one, of course. And I just want to highlight, of course, Tim Myhook from Lake Champlain Research Institute, also part of Lake Champlain Sea Grant. Tim and Luke have been instrumental. All of this work wouldn't have been possible without them and their assistance. They're just, again, fantastic people all around. Lake Champlain Basin program, or Lake Champlain Basin, excuse me, has so many wonderful people, but then it's kind of a real high density of niceness, I guess you could say. But it's a great place. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? Well, I like to think of things kind of in broad context and try to kind of focus on the areas that I know the most about. And so I know the most about physical things, having a physics background. I know a little bit about chemistry with the chemistry background too. In biology, I rely on my colleagues for some help with that. But all these things are related to each other, and you can't really change one without changing another. And so if we want to address a problem, whether it's going to be flooding, or worry about climate change or temperatures in our water or currents, all those are going to be directly related in one way or another to the water quality of the lake, or the nutrients and the kind of oxygen in the water. All these things are coupled to each other. And of course, those things then also influence the biology. The biology influences the physical things too, the currents, and by potentially shielding, for example. If you have a bunch of things living at the top of the ocean, of the lake, you're going to have a lot less sunlight penetrating downwards. It's going to influence the temperatures and cascades, and then circle and circle and circle and circle. And so while we tend to focus on one of these aspects, I really like to think of things as a picture. And so we want to worry about phosphorus pollution, or algal blooms, or anything you want to talk about, is going to be holistic, in my opinion, is the best way to go about it. Look at everything, the physical aspects and the chemical aspects. That said, each one of these components then has some sort of external driver that's affecting it. So, physical stuff, climate change or weather is going to influence the temperature and the currents of the lake, perhaps, and the hydrology, the flooding, and all of that, which again then would cascade to issues in chemistry and biology and back and forth and so on. We have contaminants and pollutants that go in the water that influence the biology, and then that can influence the physics and yada 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 and so on, invasive species. And these are all external drivers that are basically modifying Lake Champlain from what we can know it to have been historically, and will dictate what it's like in the future. And so what I'm focused on, lots of people focus on pollution, a lot of people focused on invasive species, and all these things are really interesting and extraordinarily important. But my interests lie primarily with climate change and weather phenomena, because my background as atmospheric scientist, and someone says air pollution as well. And so, one of the things that we're looking at then is, how do these things influence the lake? And so one of the most characteristic things about Lake Champlain, as many of you probably know, is that it moves quite frequently, right? Has some very strong currents in it, has a very strong seiche in it. And so we have currents that are always being pushed by the winds. The lake would be mostly static, and there'd be a little bit of flow from the rivers, but without the winds. And the winds are really the driving force of most large water bodies. And so these storms, these wind events can really have an impact on what we see happening inside the lake. And then, through my arrows of connectivity here, the chemistry and the biology of what's happening as well. And so one of the things that I've been most interested in, and Tom Manley from Middlebury and many others have been interested in for a while, is what happens when a large wind event occurs in the lake. If you imagine kind of this being a schematic of the lake, we can break the lake into three kind of levels, typically in the summertime. So we have epilimnion near the surface, which is where the warm water lives, hypolimnion down at the bottom, which is where the cold water lives. And so this is kind of the bottom of the lake down here, and this is the top up here near the surface. And if we have a strong wind event, really strong wind blowing along the axis of the lake. And so Lake Champlain, if you think about it, is long and narrow. And when it blows along that long axis, it blows all the warm water to one side. And so you can see the red warm water pooling, in this case, on the north side, and the south side being kind of left exposed with some of the cold water. And one of the interesting things then is that it means that all of the things that were on the surface, which is going to be living things, the biology, also the chemicals that are there, the water pollutants, the phosphorus, all those things that we tend to worry about at the surface, will then get pushed to one end of the lake, and the other end of the lake will get exposed potentially to water from deeper down. And that water will be colder, and that water will have a different chemistry and different biological makeup than the water that left. And so our goal, as I'll say in a second, kind of is to figure out, well, what happens? What happens when these things are moving around? What happens when all of this is occurring? And so there's two things that we kind of can talk about when we think about this. The first is the bulk motion of the lake, which is what I'll mainly focus on today, which is basically the wind moves and then the lake gets pushed, and then the resulting kind of circulation that happens there. An equally important, probably, and far less understood way, though, that things get mixed around or moved around inside the lake is at the interfaces. And so there's great potential for there to be some mixing across these boundaries that you see here. And it all depends on how stable the lake is. We'll talk about that in a second, and also how strong these currents are. Oops, I don't know how that happened. Okay. So we're interested in these things. And at this point, we're going to analyze some things in terms of the bulk motions, but these kind of more complicated instability things, like things that might produce something called a Kelvin-Helmholtz wave or things like that happen to the interface. Those are really important and something that we think we can tease out of our data, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. Okay, so just as a quick example of this, this is a data, I've shown this before at Sea Grant presentations, from our Valcor island buoy, data buoy, where you can see the top is the wind speed, and then the middle is the colors show the temperature of the lake from the surface down. So the surface is here and down to about 50 meters. And then this is the temperature profile at the minute that we see the data going through here on the wind. And what we see here is, this big kind of a transition at this site where our temperatures go from being kind of quite warm, the scale is lost here, but a very dark red color, to being kind of in the orange. And those changes can be on the order of like 10 to 15, depending where you are, it's a little bit deeper, 20 degrees Celsius. And those flips can have remarkable influence on what's happening. And so again, the wind really does play an important role, and we're trying to figure out how much and how important is it for us to worry about when we think about things like water quality and the biology of the lake, the ecology of the lake. Okay, so I was extremely fortunate then for Sea Grant to kind of pick up this idea and let us explore it. Again, I can't thank enough the folks at Sea Grant for their help, including Mark Malkoff, who has since retired. And our goals for this project kind of is to determine kind of what happens with these storm events. You know, we think this happens. Can we observe it in the chemistry and in the biology as well as in the physical things? So kind of connecting all those arrows in the circle. And you know, one of the places that I want to take this, and I think is really important, is to assess whether or not you know, those events will change as we begin to look into the future. We know that certain weather regimes are going to be modified as our climate warms, and so we can you know, we want to make sure that we're able to understand what's going to happen and project what to expect. And again, all of this, I said a couple times, all of this wouldn't have been possible without Tom from Middlebury doing so much legwork and field work and just being a great source of information as well. Okay, so what observations did we collect? We collected a boatload, no pun intended, yes, pun intended, of observations of from the we call the South Main Lake, and so you can see here's the bridge right here, and we had just primarily in for 3 years an ADCP site, and what ADCP is an acoustic Doppler current profiler, and that allows us to look at the current speed in the water, so how quickly the currents are moving and what direction they're moving. And I'll show you some data from one of those in just a minute. But these are something that really kind of add an important bit of knowledge to what we're looking at. We also had, and that was the first one, was up here. We also had a series of temperature measurements to figure out the thermal structure, to figure out what temperatures were like, and you know, the layering of the water columns. And so we had kind of one here at the main site, but also Tom and Middlebury put out some of the green dots that you can see here on the right. Plattsburgh, we put out a meteorological buoy that measured the weather as well as a temperature observations from the surface down to about 15 meters there. And then the last 2 years, Tom had a few extra acoustic Doppler current profilers that he was able to deploy for us, and absolutely became sort of a game changer what we're able to do, because we now ended up going from having just kind of this one site up here to having an additional 5 sites. And so those are the squares that you can see right here. And I'm drawing circles around a square. Oops. But where it's circled, those are where there's additional acoustic Doppler current profilers were placed by Tom. And they really added a lot of information, because it's now going to be not just something looking at what's happening along the north-south side axis of the lake, but it gives us the ability to understand what's happening a little bit on the eastern and western sides. If you look at where he placed them, you know, they're kind of hugging the coast a little bit, and or the shore a little bit, and gives us information there. So finally, we also have some chemical and biological observations that were collected by SUNY Plattsburgh, as well as SUNY Plattsburgh and Vermont DEC as part of the long-term monitoring program. So basically, data that we can use to help interpret what we're finding. Okay. So first thing I want to do is I want to look at an event. Okay, and so I have a weather background. I used to teach meteorology quite a bit, and so weather maps are my language, but not everyone's language. And so I want to point out what we see on this weather map. And so this weather map is from August 6, 2019, and what you can see here is a big, it's called a mid-latitude cyclone, or a low pressure, and it's moving towards the east, and as they do. And as it's moving to the east, it has along with it its cold front, which you can see in blue. And so that's when, you know, a few days later, boom, temperatures get colder. This is August, and so this is one of those days where you just love going outside and feeling the cool air all of a sudden as it arrives, right? It's been hot, muggy, and humid, and then the cold front goes through and you feel better. But associated with these are also, of course, are winds, right? And so these are also wind events. And the geography of the Lake Champlain Basin funnels it in the south to north direction primarily, or north-south. And as this storm was approaching from the west, we had a strong south wind. And so wind from the south means going from the south to the north along the axis of the lake. And as it began to move through, that wind receded, went away, didn't really change direction as it sometimes would, but in this particular month, but they receded. And so what I'm going to show you now is kind of the wind observations for August, and we'll kind of look at those events. So on the top, you can see the wind at Colchester Reef. And in particular, I picked out just the component, or just the part of the wind that's in the north and south direction. And so if it's positive, it means the wind's blowing from south to north, what we would call a south wind. And if it's kind of below, it's a negative number, it's a north wind, which means it's coming from the north. I know it's confusing. Meteorologists do that to play games with their minds. And oceanographers do things backwards, just to play with their minds. And so what we see is that August 6th storm, you can see it coming through, and we have some strong winds coming from the south. And so this is basically means the wind is going in a northward direction. And so it's moving from the south towards the north. And another event happened August 16 to August 20. And you can see kind of a big kind of, and I've kind of highlighted it with these purple boxes. You can see these events highlighted there, these big bursts of wind. If we look down at what we see down below, the times are matched up to the best that I was able to do so. What you see below is the currents, or what's happening inside of the lake. And so this is the surface up here, and this is the bottom of this particular site, which is 50 meters deep. And the colors that you see tell you the amount or the strength of the current that's flowing at our main site, which remember was right here. I'll draw a third arrow right there to highlight it. And so when our winds were kind of moving from the south to the north, so this instance right here, we can see at depths, we can see a southward moving current. And that matches what we would expect to see from this. If the wind is pushing the top water towards the north, I'm using my hands, if the push the water towards the north, then the bottom water will have to come back up to replace it like this. And we actually do see, in both instances, we can see it right here in the August 6th storm, and also in the August 16th storm. And again, one that I didn't really analyze out here in August 26th as well. We can see those southward moving kind of bursts that don't necessarily make it all the way up to the surface, but they do make it kind of show us what's happening. And then as that happens, we see the relaxation, and everything goes back to being moving towards the north again, which is part of the kind of the rectifying of our seiche, or having kind of the things go back to the directions that we'd expect them to be. So this is really cool, be able to couple all of this together. And this is a movie that Tom made last year, that shows all of our temperature measurements. And you can see we're in May right now. Get my pointer. And I'm going to jump ahead to August. And so each one of these is a place that we're measuring temperature from the surface down to the bottom. And as our it doesn't seem to want to play. There. So now we're entering August. Sorry about that, technical gaffes. So here we're entering August, and what we're about to see is August 6th comes around, is we'll see that a burst of cold water, which is the blue that you can see on the bottom. So the bottom is showing what we would look like, what a curtain would look like if we kind of threw a curtain down the spine of the lake, and you can see there's a big blue surge that came, which was like cold water arriving. And then here's another one on the 16th into the 20th or so. You can see another big bulge of cold water coming down as the wind pushes the surface water all the way up towards the other side of the lake, north side of the lake. And we can see that in our data here. So this is just highlighting that event, and this is our observations from Valcour Island, which is kind of in the middle part of the lake, versus Plattsburgh's observations at the south main lake part. And we can see for the 20th, for example, you can see that, so the temperature here is purple and blues is cold and reds is hot. You can see a big kind of bulge of cold water that came that affected not just the surface, but also upwards near the bottom, but also upwards near the surface too. Okay, so what did that do to things, to biology and chemistry? Well, what we were able to do was to look at some of these things. And so here is some observations that were collected by SUNY Plattsburgh folks, in particular folks working with Tim Myhook and Luke Myers, looking at kind of the biological makeup of the zooplankton that were living at that time and at our South Main Lake location, so kind of down where it was. And you can see that on the date that we were looking at where that bulge of kind of cold water came, there was a high amount of this darker or midweight gray color, which tells us that there was quite a bit of rotifers in the sampling. And rotifers have a cold preference and would tend to be at greater depths. But in this case, the water has physically moved them and caused them to come kind of to a place that's shallower and also potentially up towards the surface. And so the biology is changing along with the currents. Not only are we seeing the currents, but we also, the wind affecting the currents, but we're also indirectly then seeing the winds affect where the biological makeup of things is. And there's nothing, this is what we would expect, but what's really cool about it is we're actually seeing it. We're actually able to put the data together to make the story that connects these things. At the same time, by the way, we also saw at the surface and at depths increases in the amounts of phosphorus, so the chemical nature of the place has changed as well. So in the South Main Lake, we had a much higher concentration of phosphorus, which is again due to kind of some water from the depth coming up where there might be a store of phosphorus, or the currents running along some of the bottom and liberating some phosphorus that was bound there. And it's lower than what we would see kind of up more into the main lake area of the lake. And so we see this not just on the 20th, but also we can look at that earlier August story too, where we can see kind of a preference for the rotifers, which are again in the middle gray, kind of are bigger. And actually, even on an 820, when we had a particularly strong one, that's when we had the highest density of zooplankton, period. And so it really changed not only the composition, but the amount of biology or living things in that particular time period. Okay, so that was really cool. And able to piece it all together. And this is all from 2019. So we have some more data that we're still looking at from 2020 and 2021. And what's interesting about that is the story is more complicated. And so, the idea that the wind blows south to north, pushes the surface water to the north, and then the deep water comes up is a grand tale that's been told for many decades. But it's a little more complicated than that. And we had an idea this might be the case, but we can see it quite clearly with Tom's additional data that he collected for us the last 2 years. So here's an example from August of 2020, I believe it is. And I'm going to show you, or I'm showing you, the currents at 2 different sites. So site 2 here, which is kind of on the western side of the South Main Lake, and site 4, which is on the eastern side. And so you can see site 4 is a little bit shallower. But if we look at what we see, again, this is the north-south component. And so if it is kind of a red color, that's going to mean that it is moving in a northward direction. And if it is a blue or purple color, it's going to be moving in a southward direction. And if we look at some events here, so in particular, I'm thinking about kind of this broader event right here. And these events right here. The directions are out of phase with each other. And so that means that they're flowing in opposite directions. So in this instance, at site 4, it's moving to the north. And in this instance, it's moving primarily to the south. And so they're going against each other. Similarly, this on the right here, we can see is moving towards the south. And here it's moving towards the north. And so what that means is that we don't necessarily have kind of some grand uniform flow one direction, but instead it's kind of like all science is more complicated than you first think. And so we actually have some motion happening that's a little bit more complicated. And we had some idea this might be the case. This is a movie produced by a simulation by Tom Manley, and then the movie itself was produced by Ann Bowen and Greg Abram for the Texas Advanced Computer Center. And what it's showing us is kind of like a simulation. This is from 2017, but the idea is there. And you're going to see a couple different things. So on the right, you're going to see kind of on an inset, you're going to see the surface temperature of the water that's as it's simulated. And on the left, you're going to see temperature of the water, but it's only showing us the temperature of the water if it's below 13 degrees C, or excuse me, above 13 degrees C. No, below 13 degrees C. And the reason why 13 degrees C is that that's a good hallmark of where the break is between the surface and the depth in Lake Champlain. So as we see, we'll see some interesting things. So right now, even where I just happenstance deposit, we can see some differences of what's happening on the right side or the east side of the lake versus the western side of the lake. It's April, so it's not super necessarily connected with what we saw just a second ago, but we can still see it. And as it progresses, you'll be able to see again this kind of a difference between what's happening on the east side and the west side. And so this is really cool because this is kind of models being vindicated by observations. Models are great. I'm a modeler by training, observationist by recent interests, and I always like the phrase models are kind of like hot dogs. No one wants to know what goes in them, but everyone loves them. And this is exactly kind of a great example of like we really get a cool result out of this. Again, you can see the dichotomy between the left and the east and the west side here. Get a really cool result out of it, but you have to be careful in interpreting it. And we're actually, a lot more work to do here, but we can say that it looks like in the observations match what we see in the model. Okay, so where are we headed? So we're going to continue to analyze our data, try to quantify these events and calculate some more advanced parameters, including something called the Richardson number, which really kind of gets at how mixing is happening and whether or not it's able to kind of happen at those interfaces. Continue to model to improve our process-based understanding. Modeling is great because you can play so many what-if situations, and what-ifs really kind of allow us to test our knowledge and figure out what's happening in a way that just observations can't. And so we're also, one of the things I'm really interested in determining the potential for climate change to impact the frequency of these events, or the strength of these events to happen. And the top there, we have just so much data has been produced over the last 3 years. I put a note there from Tom. So from Tom alone, you can see that in his analysis, he's produced 4,000 lines of code, and there's 236 million ADCP values and 11.6 million temperature values. So we have a lot of data reduction to do in the near term. Okay, so one of the things that I want to do as a final thing is go back to this slide and kind of try to make all this a little bit more relevant for everyone. And I guess one of the take homes that I want to make or have you leave with is that if you're interested in one of these things, whether it's water quality or whether it's the biology of the lake or the ecology of the lake, you can't study any of these single things without understanding everything else. And so as we begin to, make plans in order to improve water quality or to ensure, the ecosystem stays healthy in the way that it is, we can't think of things in terms of just isolated boxes. The role that climate change might play could be important. And when we take our observations, understanding that the weather context is also important. There are years where we have lots of storms, and so the lake has a lot of motion to it, and there are years where there aren't as many. And that variability, those variations influence then the water quality and the biology as well. And that might skew our perceptions of success of an action or what even to do. And so as we begin to kind of move forward, again, trying to think holistically, what are the things that we can do, and can we take into account each one of these aspects and make sure that we're not kind of getting the right answer for the wrong reason. So, okay, with that, I want to thank Ashley and Molly for moderating today, and for Sea Grant for all the great things that they've done for me over the years. For everyone at Sea Grant, and I'd be happy to take any questions. If you think of something later, feel free to email me, and my email address is right there. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Eric. I think, walking away from this presentation, I'm definitely